I kept moving, running, then walking, all night. Early the next morning, I reached the road I had worked on the previous day. I headed for Mr. Turnbull's cottage. I needed to collect my clothes and, more importantly, Scudder's notebook. It was still very early when Mr. Turnbull answered the door. I almost did not recognize him. The sober man before me was dressed in black. He was carrying a pocket Bible. Nor did he remember me. "Who are you?" he asked. "And why are you here on a Sunday morning?" I tried to answer, but my head was swimming. The fumes from the gunpowder had given me a terrible headache. I could not find the right words. Mr. Turnbull looked more closely at me. "Oh, it's you. You've come for your clothes." Still unable to speak, I nodded and held onto the wall. My shoulder was very sore and seemed to be swelling. I had no use of my left arm. "You're not well, my friend," said Mr. Turnbull. "Come in and sit down. You'll need to stay here until you feel better." Mr. Turnbull proved a true friend. For nearly 10 days, he helped nurse me back to health. He went out each morning, leaving me milk for the day and locking the door behind him. In the evening, he returned to sit in silence by the fire. Nobody came near his cottage. While I was getting better, he never bothered me with a question. After a week, he brought me a 2-day-old Scotsman. To my relief, there was no mention of the Portland Place murder. He never even asked my name. And when I tried to give him money as I left, he refused to accept it. "One good turn deserves another," he said, pushing away my money. "You helped me when I needed help." There never was a more independent man. I left the money anyway and said farewell. I caught the midnight train south from a quiet local station. This took me across the border to England, arriving at Crewe early in the morning. From there I took a train to Birmingham and then another to Reading. I was heading for the cottage of Sir Harry's uncle, the cabinet minister, Sir Walter Bullivant. Changing onto a local train, I finally arrived at Artinswell. From the station, I could see the Kennet Canal. I followed it until I came to a bridge. A fisherman was waiting there. I could see the family likeness to Sir Harry. I handed him the letter from his nephew. "That's my house," he said, pointing to a white gate 100 yards on. "Wait 5 minutes and go round the back door." And with that, he left me. A butler stood waiting for me at the back door of the cottage. "No," said Sir Walter, lighting a cigar. "But I recently received a letter from Scudder." "From Scudder? But it was written while he was at your flat. In this letter, Scudder says that we can trust you. Now, show me this notebook, shaving brushes and shoes." "Sir Walter thought these would fit you, sir," said the butler. "There's a bathroom next door, and I have run you a hot bath. Dinner is in half an hour, sir. You will hear the gong." The butler left the room. I looked in the mirror. I saw a wild, unshaven, sunburned man with dust in my hair. A bath and clean clothes transformed me. 20 minutes later, I walked down to dinner, a presentable young man. Sir Walter was waiting for me in the dining room. "Now, tell me your story, Mr. Hannay." I told him about Scudder in my flat and his warning about Karolides. I described the murder and my escape to Scotland. I mentioned the notebook and the code. "Have you got the notebook here?" he said sharply. He drew a long breath when I took the little book from my pocket. I then mentioned the adventure with his nephew. Sir Walter laughed. "Harry hates giving speeches," he said. Sir Walter became more serious when I talked about Scudder. "I think he was a good man," I said. To my surprise, Sir Walter nodded. "We do too," he said, "and we know you didn't kill him." This was astonishing news. "Really?" I cried. "Had they found the murderer?" "No," said Sir Walter, lighting a cigar. "But I recently received a letter from Scudder." "From Scudder? But it was written while he was at your flat. In this letter, Scudder says that we can trust you. Now, show me this notebook." After studying the notebook, Sir Walter sat silent for a while. "What are these 39 steps?" "I don't know," I said. "High tide suggests something to do with the sea." "Possibly, yes," said Sir Walter. "Perhaps the name of a ship. I will discuss it with Lord Alloa tomorrow." "The First Lord of the Admiralty?" "Yes, we're meeting here in this house. Karolides is attending too." Just then, the butler entered the room. "The Prime Minister from London, Sir Walter. He says it's urgent." My host went off to the telephone. He returned after 5 minutes. I could see from his face that something terrible had happened. "Karolides will not be attending the meeting," he said. "He was shot dead this evening at a few minutes after 7. I came down to breakfast at 7:30 the next morning. Sir Walter was reading a telegram while eating muffins and marmalade. He looked anxious. "Scudder's notes suggest the Germans are planning an early attack on our coast. Mr. Hannay, would you agree to help us?" "Of course, Sir Walter. I would like you to stay here today. Please carry on working on Scudder's notebook. We need more information, particularly about those 39 steps." "What about the meeting?" "It's too late to cancel now, but the meeting remains top secret. Please stay out of sight while it takes place." I started work on Scudder's book straight after breakfast. Was there a clue I had missed? I began checking all the code again. For 2 hours I made no progress. I closed the notebook and went to the window. I looked out over the canal. It was another beautiful June morning. The water shone in the sunlight. Suddenly I remembered something. I opened the notebook again and found the place I was looking for. 39 steps, I read. I counted them. High tide, 10:17 p.m. Rough. This was Scudder's note to himself. What was he describing? How did the steps connect to the high tide? The answer came to me in a flash. I hurried down to see Sir Walter. He was at his desk, surrounded by reports and telegrams. I think the 39 steps refers to their escape route, I said. What do you mean? When they have completed their mission, the agents will leave the country. They can only do this by sea. I'm sorry, I don't follow, said Sir Walter. How does this connect to the steps? That I don't know, I said. But we need to narrow down the number of possible departure points. We are looking for somewhere with high tide at 10:17. Sir Walter thought for a moment. I think we have a copy of the Admiralty tide tables in the library, he said. And I'd like to talk to a Coast Guard, I said. Someone who knows all the small ports on the east coast. He nodded. There is a Coast Guard inspector who lives in Clapham. I'll arrange for him to come up from London this afternoon. After lunch, I stayed in my room. The shutters were down, but through a gap I could see the guests arriving for the meeting. They parked their cars out by the road. Then they walked the final 50 yards to the house. The French General, Royer, arrived first. A few minutes later, two gentlemen approached. The older man was wearing a naval uniform with an admiral's cap. The butler said, "Good afternoon, Lord Alloa." The door closed. The older man entered the house. His companion headed back to his car, just visible beyond the bushes. I sat on my bed and opened the Admiralty tide tables. There were over 50 entries, with high tide at 10:17. I was confused by the 39 steps. Why had Scudder written the exact number? I went through every possibility in my mind. At some point, I fell asleep. I awoke to hear the sound of the front door opening. I could also hear voices. "Shall I arrange a car for you, Lord Alloa?" "No, thank you. My driver is waiting." The door closed as I approached the window. I carefully lifted a shutter and looked out. At that moment, Lord Alloa turned back towards the house. He looked up. For a second, we looked each other in the face. My heart jumped. In that second, I recognized a familiar face. Only it was not that of Lord Alloa. In the near distance, I heard a car starting. Sir Walter was still with General Royer in the dining room. I walked straight in without knocking. The two men looked up from the maps they were studying. Sir Walter's face showed surprise and annoyance. "This is Mr. Hannay," he told the General. "Hannay, we are discussing important business. I will talk to you later." "We have no time," I said. "Who was the man who just left?" "Lord Alloa," Sir Walter said, his face reddening with anger. "No," I cried. "It looked like Lord Alloa. You have never met him before, have you?" "Not personally, no, but—" "Then his appearance fooled you." "It almost fooled me." The two men looked at each other in confusion. "What nonsense," said Sir Walter. "Really, Hannay?" "That was not Lord Alloa," I insisted. "That was the man who imprisoned me in Scotland." At that moment, the butler came back into the room. "I am very sorry to interrupt, gentlemen," he said, There's an urgent message for Sir Walter from Downing Street. Sir Walter went out of the room to take the call. When he returned, his face was grave. "You were right, Hannay," he said. "Lord Alloa has been taken to hospital with suspected poisoning." "Then who was the man who was with us this afternoon?" said General Royer. "I think he is planning to leave the country tonight," I said. "They will sail from somewhere north of Dover." The French general and the cabinet minister looked at each other. "That could be anywhere along hundreds of miles of coast," said Sir Walter. The butler came into the room. "The Coast Guard inspector has arrived, sir. Shall I send him in?" "Please do." The Coast Guard inspector was a fine old fellow with a big beard. Sir Walter described the place we were looking for. There are cliffs and steps that lead down to the beach. Above the beach there is a house, a holiday villa. This property has access to the beach by steps. The Coast Guard stroked his chin thoughtfully. "The only place I can think of is the Rough." "What's that?" I asked. Something about the name sounded familiar. "Close to Bradgate. It's an exclusive area, sir, with expensive villas. Some of the houses have staircases that lead down to a private beach." This reminded me of something I'd read in Scudder's notebook. I opened it and found the page I was looking for. "Look what it says here," I said. "High tide, 10:17 p.m. Rough." I tore open the tide tables. High tide at Bradgate would be at 10:27. I turned to the Coast Guard. "How can I find out what time the tide will be at the Rough?" "I can tell you that," said the Coast Guard. "I used to go out deep sea fishing there. The tide is 10 minutes before Bradgate." "But why does he say 39 steps? I counted them." "Because, sir, there are several sets of steps leading to that beach," said the Coast Guard. "They are all different sizes, but only one has 39 steps," I said. The dining room clock struck 6. I turned to Sir Walter. "We only have a few hours to stop them from escaping with the plans. I need your car and a map of the roads from here to Bradgate. We haven't a moment to lose." Trafalgar House was a seafront villa in an exclusive suburb of Bradgate. Locals said that 2 Scottish businessmen were renting it. They were members of the local tennis club, though they had not been attending for some weeks. The villa had access to a private beach via a set of stone steps. I stood on the beach looking up at Trafalgar House. Along the beach there were several sets of steps. I had counted them all. It was dark now, and there were lights in the windows of the villa. I looked at my watch. 10:15. I could hear the waves behind me. Just off the coast, a German yacht was waiting. Suddenly, the lights went out. I watched and waited. An old man hurried out from under the cliff. He descended the last of the 39 steps. A second, younger man followed behind him. I stepped forward to greet them. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said. "We meet again." The older man halted. He was wearing a business suit and a hat. "I'm sorry," he said. "You are mistaken. We have never met before." "Oh, yes, we have," I said. "Last time I left you in a hurry. Now you can meet some of my friends." I lifted a whistle to my lips and blew it. Suddenly, policemen came running down the beach from both directions. The old man turned and shouted instructions in German to his partner. The second man dodged past me and ran towards the sea. He jumped into a small boat and pushed out into the waves. The old man looked at me with blazing eyes. "He is safe," he cried. "You cannot catch him. He is gone with your plans." A moment later, the police took over. As they fastened his handcuffs, I said, "Your friend is going to prison. We have had your yacht in our hands for the last hour." That August, the world went to war. I joined the British Army in the first week, but I had done my best service, I think, before I put on my uniform.